Well, hello everybody. This is going to be a tutorial on the Arnold render and just some of the very basics to get us started. We're going to start off by modeling a couple things. So we're going to start by doing some sort of ground plane. So here's our ground plane. Let's increase some of our subdivisions, at least in one direction. That will be good. We'll maybe grab a curve or a deformer. Bend deformer. So we've created the bend deformer, and I'll just hold J to step rotate, and then I let go of J. Let's increase the curvature and realize I need to also rotate it 90 degrees this way, so hold J, then we step, and we increase the curvature about there. We're going to take off the low bound. We can just move this back and forth until we get a nice wall, and we'll just go ahead and delete history, freeze transformations, yada yada. Now we'll go ahead and create a sphere. Drag it up, scale it up. Okay. So there we have our scene ready to go for doing some basic rendering. Might scale that up just a little more. Hold V and snap the pivot there so when I scale it I don't lose my ground plane. Good. Let's go to make a render camera. So panels, perspective, new. We'll call this the shot cam. And let's turn on the film gate, resolution gate or film gate, and compose. So we can just do a straight on shot. We'll go to our render settings. So render settings right here. Click that open, and we'll change the output. We're going to do something a little more full or square format there. Notice the device aspect ratio is 1.33. So to take our camera, and we're going to make the film aspect ratio here to be the same, 1.333. That way, when I go back and forth between my film gate and resolution gate, I get no change. So once we get a camera in position and we have the ratio ready to go, maybe zoom in just a little bit. Go ahead and lock the camera, and I'm going to jump out of here, so Maya perspective, so we can kind of see our scene set up. And let's go make sure we have the Arnold plugin loaded. That sometimes just automatically gets unloaded. So we'll go to Windows, Setting Preferences, Plugin Manager, and that should pop up a window. And we'll scrub down until we get to the MTOA. Mine is already loaded, so if not, make sure you check both of those boxes. Very important. Great, so now we have these two objects in our scene. Let's open up our Arnold render view. So on the Arnold shelf button here, you have this eyeball with a tab, and when you click that, it'll open up a render view. So I want to go ahead and dock that over here on the side. There we go. Well, that's not quite where I wanted it, but let's open that up. Okay. So this is going to be our render view. Make it maybe a little larger. And you can zoom in on this render view, pan it, middle mouse, the same way you move a camera over here. Now let's take just a little overview here of this render settings. These are just some different ways of viewing your image and rendering different stuff. So you can look at your RGB channels, your alpha, your 1:1 ratio. You can isolate selected objects. You can actually select objects from the render viewport. We can do the exposure settings, cropping, and then we have these playing and the refresh and the display buttons as well. So there's a kind of a lot of little things just here within this render window. Up here we have some menu items that we'll be using. Right now we just kind of want to take our render, make sure progressive refinement is turned on, and then on your where is it? Where are you? Test resolution, sorry. View test resolution. We're going to start lower, so maybe just even like 25%. So that would be 25% of the render settings. So it's going to be quite small, but it's going to make a render go a lot faster while we block things in. Great, so now that we're going to do this, we want to make sure we have the right camera that we're rendering selected. So to do that, we're going to go into render, camera, and that's interesting, it's not even showing many options there. Well, let's go ahead and press play and see what happens. There we go. So as soon as I press play, it sort of updated and refreshed this, so we can actually go to the shot cam shape. So there, and as soon as you press play, it's going to do what's called an IPR render, which means it's just going to keep rendering even if you make changes to, say, the position of the camera or the ball, and it will just restart over anytime it notices a change has been made to the scene, lighting, settings, or whatnot. But you'll see nothing, and the reason is because we have no lights. So let's add a light. Now, Arnold up here on the top left, this is an Arnold area light. So we're just going to start with that as a basic bit of lighting. And I'll rotate it and kind of put it into the scene. You notice that I have not even stopped the render. The render is actually still going. So as I move that into position, you would kind of expect to see some light. And yet we don't, unless I get really, really close to the ball. Right? So now that I've gotten really close to it, I'll kind of rotate it this way a little bit. You're starting to see something, but man, it just seems so dark. Well, we need to crank up the light settings for this. It does have a little fall off, so obviously it's not strong enough to get there. So we'll go to the attribute editor for that light, and let's start by increasing the exposure. So if I increase the exposure, say to 5, obviously we're going to get a lot more light we see in there. We can also increase the intensity of the light as well. Okay. So you have intensity and you have exposure. So intensity is a linear fall off. So where exposure is exponential, right? So what happens oftentimes if you have intensity down really low, you go to 5 and you hit 6 and then you hit 7, it just kind of gets incrementally lighter, right? So you're like, okay, so maybe if I go to 10, you're like, wow, that got blown out. And then if I go jump to 11, it gets really intense. If I hit 12, it's like blowing out the whole scene. So because of that think of an exponential curve on a graph, and so the exposure is just going to get more and more lighter. And it's more true to like an f-stop in photography. So the way I think of this is use the exposure to kind of get the macro setting, and then use your intensity slider to kind of dial it in, something between 0 and 1. So if you put your intensity at 1, then you bring your exposure up until like that's like, okay, I wouldn't want it any brighter than probably right there. So now I can just kind of dial in my intensity somewhere between 0 and 1. Alright, so that's a good way to use the intensity and exposure settings for the light. And you'll also notice that the size of the light has a pretty large effect on everything. This is like a softbox, right, for like in photography. So it's like a box diffuser has been put in front of a light, and it gives some size to it, so it's going to soften the shadows. So if I make the box bigger, right, now we're getting softer and softer shadows. If I make the box a lot smaller, it makes it more like a little point light, and the shadows get much sharper. So use this as a way to control the size of the light, and you might even do tall and skinny lights as well. And I'll get more into that when we do reflections. So now that we've got a light in our scene, let's go ahead and look at some of the shaders we can assign to make this, because right now we just have a basic Lambert assigned. So to create a new material, one of the easiest ways is just to select the object, right click, and we'll just say assign new material, and that will open up this window, and we just go to Arnold and we select shader, and we'll see a list of Arnold shaders, and we're just going to be taking a look at the AI standard surface. It's going to cover most materials that you need. And immediately the first difference you'll notice is we have a highlight, and this is a specular highlight or reflection of the light source right here. And as I make the light source bigger and smaller, you'll notice that the shape is represented accurately or reflected in the ball. Let's go ahead and increase, create a shader for this ground plane as well. So right click, assign new material. We'll go to the Arnold shader standard as well. So one of the first attributes, you see the list of attributes for each shader. Let's just mess with the background shader first for the ground plane. So that first attribute we have is the base. This is where we have our basic color, so if I make it darker, it will get some darker values, of course. And the weight is sort of how much influence does this color have over the ball. So if I take the weight down to 0, then this background becomes disappears pretty much. We do still see a reflection here in the ground plane. And actually let me bring this forward a little bit so we can kind of maybe get a little bit more of a reflection. Take a look at that. Oops. So we're starting to see that reflection of this ball down in here. But that has nothing to do with this actual base weight color. Okay. The diffuse and the metalness are two other things that will be more apparent when we look at the ball. So let's go ahead and take a look at the ball. Let's bring that weight back up to 0.8. It's default. And let's grab the ball and let's take a look at that. So the metalness is sort of a way of making something more chrome and more reflective, right? So if I take the metalness all the way up to 1, it's pretty much a mirror at this point. We have a black sky, we have this ground plane down here reflecting, and we see the light source reflecting right there. And we're also even seeing the reflection of the light source in the ground. So that's our metalness. So if you want something more chrome, or full chrome, just to increase the metalness all the way to 1. If we bring the metalness down, then it's not quite so chrome. And we do have this diffuse roughness, alright? So the roughness of the diffuse channel is going to make things either, it's going to take that diffuse color and the weight of it and sort of soften it. So a good way to think about the diffuse roughness, let's take down our metalness, and the diffuse roughness at 0 is going to be comparable to maybe like a Lambert, very kind of matte surface. But if we increase that roughness, it's going to start to resemble something like concrete or sand. So that's, I would kind of think of it that way, is if you want to go a little more plastic, then we go this way. If we want it more concrete or sand, something where the light is going to be very matte, very diffused across the material, then we increase the roughness. Alright, so there's the basic standard stuff. Let's open up our specular channel and take a look at the specular. So the weight of the specular is going to basically say how reflective is our object. If you're more familiar with something like a blend, then the specular in this standard shader is going to, this specular channel is going to be more like the reflections of a blend. So that reflection channel, and on a blend, the reflection and the specular are two separate channels. Here they're basically one and the same, which is more accurate to kind of a real world physics. The specular highlight is just a reflection of the light source, so if we change the reflectivity of an object, then it will change the specularity as well. Now the weight, so here's just basically turning it on and off, and you see if we turn it off, it does become more like a normal Lambert material. But if we increase that, then we get a sharper and more, or at least a stronger reflection. Now the sharpness of these reflections is going to be controlled by the roughness. So the roughness, the more I spread out the roughness, the more that specularity becomes more satin. And if I increase it more, it kind of just becomes very Lambert-esque, very matte diffused. So you can control the specular roughness here. Now the IOR, that's the index of so the IOR is your index of refraction, and if you're not sure what that means, basically each material has a different level at which it refracts light, and this is going to be most apparent when dealing with metallic objects. But as you see, if we just click left mouse on this, it gives you some settings by default. You can go online and just do a search for IOR index, and you'll find a few different websites that list the IOR number for different materials. So we'll see how that plays into effect. So next we have the anisotropic effect, and if you increase the anisotropy here, you don't really see anything happen. And the problem with that, why we don't see anything, is because our roughness is set to 0. For an anisotropic effect, there needs to be some sort of scratches or microscopic imperfections, sort of bumps on the material. So this roughness kind of helps mimic that. And so as I bring the roughness out on this anisotropic, you'll see that it starts to spread. Let me put a little rotation so we can even get that more. So put the rotation, increase the amount of anisotropic effect, and that's going to spread across the surface. So this starts to mimic things like brushed steel. So you know, your kitchen appliances, records, for example, that would be things that have an anisotropic effect. So there's a lot of things, materials, usually, and actually, matter of fact, most materials that aren't just really smooth and glossy have a little bit of anisotropic effect to them. So it helps spread that reflection out, especially if there is a direction for the grooves to go. So imagine there's a little grooves going across this because when it was manufactured, it was milled out of steel or metal, and so it's going to create or stretch that reflection out. If I rotate it this way, that basically is saying the grooves have been cut this way, and so it's picking up little bits of reflection as it stretches out along, and it's just hitting those ridges. It's a little tricky to kind of fully get, but just imagine brushed steel. It's like sort of a I have in one of my bathrooms, we have something that holds a roll of toilet paper and it rests on the ground, right? And so it has a pole that goes up. So something like that is going to do this. And I do have a lecture just on materials where we analyze and look at photos, so I recommend looking up that lecture and that video to get more, if you want to research a little bit more about these materials, especially the anisotropic effect. So we'll just take that back down for now and keep it at 0, and we'll just have a nice specular highlight right there. Okay, so we've now dealt with the, let's go back to our material here, which I can select in here as well as on this viewport, and go back to our standard surface. And now that we've dealt with a couple of these things, let's maybe make this plastic. Why not? Okay. So the IOR of that is 1.55. Let's go ahead and go down a little bit more. Transmission, this is going to make something transparent, like glass. So if I increase this transparency, it doesn't feel very transparent. It just sort of gets darker, but it's not actually turning transparent. And the reason is, for Arnold render, we have to come into the shape node here and go to the Arnold tab, and we need to check off opaque. This allows the render to recognize this object as not being opaque, but as being transparent. So now it will respond to the transparency slider that we have here. We can add some color to that transparency if we wanted to make our glass tinted, like that. We can also have a few other options here for depth, scatter, scatter anisotropic. So we're doing a lot of little things here that go with the transmission. I think for the sake of simplicity, we'll just sort of deal with these top two for now. And I think in order to see this, actually, we need to give some thickness. So I'm going to go ahead and do our modeling and do a extrusion. Alright, and if I grab that extrusion, we come into here. Let me just turn that off for a second. Hello, let's try that again. Extrude. Extrude. There we go. Thickness 0.2. Alright, so now that we've actually made this thicker, let's press play again. And let's go to the standard surface and increase the transmission. And we'll start to see the thickness show up. Let's take the roughness down. There we go. That's a little easier. When we take the roughness down, it's a little easier for us to see the thickness of the glass. And go to the specular, and we already have that set to glass. Nope, now we do. So now we've set the IOR to glass. And we can kind of see this start to take effect. We can move down here to the subsurface. That is if we want to do something like skin. We have emission, which will actually emit a color, kind of make something glow, or kind of be like a light source. So that's another interesting thing. Coat is going to give something like an extra coat on top of it. So let's kind of go through some of these one by one and we'll check them out. I'm gonna hide, or just sort of duplicate that. Maybe just move it off to the side for a second, move it back. Press pause on that, scale it down. And let's make myself a new polygon here, a new polysphere. Bring it forward, let's press play, bring it more forward. Bigger. So one thing you can also do is you can crop a region. So you can just say, just render this little bit for me. And that way the IPR isn't trying to calculate everything in the scene, it's just doing this one little area right there. Alright, so now that we have our glass, blue glass, tinted glass over there, let's give this guy a material. So we'll say assign new material, and we'll give it a Arnold shader, and we'll make it the standard surface. All right. So with this new shader, let's close up the transmission. Let's make this some sort of color. Let's go for maybe a copper or bronze. Maybe like a copper for a pot. You might try it. So our base color for that is going to be something around here. You can pull up in some reference and sort of start to look at these colors. Find what's going to work best for you. And we'll start right there and see how that plays for us. Let's increase the metalness, so it's going to be more reflective. But I'm not going to go total chrome, right? It's always going to maintain a certain amount of color. And if I go to my specular now, let's give that some color as well. So at white, it's just a white specularity, but here I can make it more yellow or pinkish toned. I'm gonna, on my other screen, I have a copper. Not copper. Let's do a. There we go. Got some nice copper pots over there, so I'm kind of looking at those colors, finding one that I like. It's starting to analyze sort of the color and of how this looks. And I noticed the specularity kind of maintains this sort of pinkish or this warm tone, so we're going to keep that pretty strong as the color for the specularity. Alright, keep it pretty high value. Now what's the IOR? So let's take a look. I'm going to look on the IOR for copper, and what I'll find is the IOR is down here a little bit. Something that has actually a range, so it's anything from 1.1 to 2.4. So I can go from 1.1 to 2.4. Oh, that's the wrong one. 1.1 to 2.4. So somewhere around here, we're going to be okay. Apparently, copper has lots of different indexes of refraction. So here we go. Let's take the. Let's take a look at my copper reference again, and increase some of this value here. So if I increase the value, maybe make it a little more reddish there. And now I'm going to make it a little bit of a brushed steel. So we're going to diffuse, not the metalness, we're going to diffuse the specularity. Alright, so now we're going to get that. Let's increase the metalness a bit more. And now let's do some anisotropic effect as well to give it a brushed steel. So let's increase the anisotropic and maybe bring the rotation this way if you wanted to. That looks pretty nice. Cool, so we're getting some more, we increase the metalness more. It just kind of increases the amount of reflections. Maybe increase the weight of the color. Remember, I only have one light so far, so there's not a whole lot of light coming around. It has to bounce off the ground. That's about all we have. The coat, that's going to be like another coat on top of that. We'll deal with the coat probably on something more like a car paint, where you want to start making something extra shiny on top of that. But you can see it actually gives it a different color, so I can change the coat to be a different color, like a blue finish on top of it, which is pretty neat. It's a pretty neat looking effect. Increase and decrease the amount of that coat. Or I can just give the coat a nice warm glow to it, and that kind of looks nice too. Let's turn down So if I take the weight down to 0, that's without the coat, that's with it. So you can kind of see a little bit of a, this, especially this area, is feeling much more like my reference that I'm looking at. Without it, it doesn't quite have it. That sort of increases the saturation a bit, so it looks really nice. It's not really going to be emitting much, although if you wanted to get some more bounce light into the ground, sometimes the emission value does work, but as you see, it just kind of blows out. It kind of makes sort of like increasing the incandescence to something. So I'm going to not recommend doing that here. And that should pretty much cover. So there's some things here that we haven't gotten into. So we haven't gotten any subsurface. We did do some transmission. So let's go ahead and move this guy back into space. So there's our ball from there. I'm going to move him off to the side. There's our scene. A little bit of a glass ball. We have this copper. Let's make one more. Bring him up. And let's go ahead and just crop right, crop again, right in this area. Let's select him, right click, assign new material, and we'll just once again make the standard surface. And this one we're going to go for like a skin shader. So this is going to introduce the subsurface effect. So I'm going to go ahead and give it initial color of skin. So this might be like the outer coat. It's going to be kind of, we'll do a white skin, so it's going to be kind of a peachy thing. The specularity, we actually think I have skin right there. Oops, sorry. No. The IOR needs to be skin. There we go. 1.4. Let's take the specularity, a little bit of color, a little bit of yellow there, and then I'm going to increase the roughness because skin is not plastic. This is not a Barbie doll. So that's nice. So now we're getting a little more fleshy. Let's take the subsurface. And the subsurface, as you see, if I increase the weight, you start to get this kind of transparent sort of look. What's actually happening is light is passing through the object and sort of revealing a layer underneath. So sort of like a layer underneath. So if I increase that to 1, you basically see white is underneath. So this is sort of blending a color underneath what's on top. So if we change the subsurface color to, say, red, which is going to be representative of what's underneath, the blood vessels, right? So now we're going to get increase the weight, and that red is going to start to show through, and it feels more skin-esque. And you're really going to notice that subsurface color in the shadows. That's really where it's going to be the strongest. And then the radius is kind of mainly set by its value. So a large white radius is going to make the light pass through more of it. If I go really black, then the radius is very small or non-existent. So maybe increase to decide how, so think of it this way, how thick is the skin? Or is there, how thick before you hit bone or some thicker material? So if I'm doing an ear, then there's a lot of cartilage, so light's going to pass through, or maybe the tips of the fingers. But if I go down here, that's going to be more maybe like a cheek. So the light's not passing through quite as deep. And the scale is going to kind of reset the overall scale of the object in its scene. So if you have really large geometry, then you might need to reset the scale. So we'll just keep that back to, I think it was at 1. And now we have something happening here. We have a pretty nice subsurface skin shader happening. Let's go to the specular color and give that a little more warmth to it. That feels pretty good. Increase the roughness or decrease it. Maybe right about there. Maybe increase the anisotropic feel. I'll get it to spread a little bit. Okay, so now we have some skin. Let's move him back. So let's go ahead and remove our thing, and we'll see all of these playing into effect. So we have some flesh, we have a glass, and we have some copper. We've gone over the base color, the specularity. We've done transmission, meaning is it transparent? Subsurface, think something like skin. The coat, that kind of puts another coat on outside. So if you want to, you have, say, paint on one thing, and then you're going to coat that paint with a varnish. This is going to control that. And then emission is if something is like illuminated, or it is emitting light, or light's passing through. So yeah, those are some of the basic fundamentals of the shader itself. We've basically got one light in our scene. So all that's really left to do now is give ourselves a higher quality render. Alright, so now we go to View, and we'll take the test resolution up to 100%. So here we have the window. I've peeled it off, and you can hit stop for a second. So we're going to say View, test resolution 100%. That's fine. Render, everything looks good. If I click on this 1:1, it just zooms in. This is my actual pixel resolution. Zoom in more, and that starts to go more than 100%, but that keeps it at 100% for myself. So once you do that, you go ahead and just say play, and it will render out the scene. And now you can say file, save the image, and it will save wherever you tell it to save. Intro to Maya. Put it right there. So skin, or Arnold shader test, and now we're saved. So go ahead and have some fun playing with these shaders and see if you can come up with some nice ball, sphere materials. And what I usually do is I'll often, when I'm making a new material, I'll start in a separate scene, kind of making my shader, and then I can export that shader into a Maya scene where I actually have an object for this. And that way you always have these materials saved and ready to go and bring in at any time. Alright, good luck.